In the last section, we finished up our initial configuration of React Router inside the app component. We've now got different route definitions put together for each of our different major routes. We're now going to focus on the individual implementation of the header component. So rather than defining this kind of dummy header inside of here, we're going to split it off to its own separate component. Once we create it, we'll then cover a few topics around styling and CSS and design just very quickly. And then after that, we'll make sure that we stay true to our real goal right now, which is to make sure that we customize the content in the header depending on whether or not the user is currently signed in. So let's get to it. Let's make the header and do some styling inside there. To create the header, we're going to make a separate file inside of our components directory. So I'm going to make a new file called header.js. And then inside of there, we're going to create a class-based component. So I will import React and component from React at the top, and then we will define our class-based component called header. Now, just in case you're curious, I am making this a class-based component because I expect to have to place a helper or function 2 in here, which will be responsible for deciding what to render inside the header component. So we don't necessarily need to make use of component level state here. I just want to have the ability to easily organize code inside of this class-based component, as opposed to a functional component, which sometimes gets a little bit more messy. So back inside of here, we'll define our render method. For right now, I will return a div with a text of, how about just header? We'll keep it simple. And then at the bottom, we will export default header, like so. Okay, so here's our header component, all done, at least the boilerplate. We're now going to import this back into the app.js file and replace the dummy header that we have in there with this real version instead. So back inside of app.js, I'll find our dummy header component right here, and I will replace it with import header from header, like so. I'm then going to verify very quickly that the name of the component header matches the name that we used inside of the actual app component, and yep, it's definitely the same, so no other change required. Now, if we change back over to the browser, we should automatically see the refresh, and yeah, I've got the header text in there. And it's definitely a div, that's why it's a little bit smaller than the h2 we had used for the landing component. Okay, so that part was pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the design of the header component. Yes, we're not going to focus too much on the design throughout this stuff. I'm going to kind of rely on you to take care of some design elements if you really want to polish the look and feel. We are way more concerned with the actual architecture of the application. Nonetheless, I do want to make sure that the app looks better than bad. Let's put it that way. So an easy way to get some reasonable looking design is to pull in a third-party CSS library. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's look up some documentation for the library that we're going to use. In a new tab, I'll do a Google search for Materialize CSS, and then I will find the first link on here, which is at materializecss.com. This is a CSS framework that is intended for general use by any type of web application. So we could use this with jQuery, we could use this with Angular, we can use it with React. It doesn't matter. All you really get out of the box with Materialize CSS is a set of pre-done CSS files and then a couple of JavaScript plugins that you can optionally use along with your application. Now, I mention this in particular because the Materialize CSS library only has, I would say, partial compatibility with React. All of these different JavaScript components right here will not work correctly out of the box with React. And if we want to use any of those, we have to put in a little bit of additional code. Now, don't be misled by the section over here labeled as components. This is not talking about React components. This is talking about specific pre-styled elements using CSS that you can make use of. So for example, one of the possible components you can use is this card component. I kind of don't want to say component, but essentially that's how they refer to it. And when they say it's a component, all they mean to say is, hey, if you use this HTML right here, you will get something that looks like this. So it is not a React component. They're just saying, here is a pre-done snippet of HTML and CSS that you can optionally use. Now, the reason I'm going into so much detail on this is that a very common question I get is about some other common CSS libraries called stuff like React Materialize, So if we look at this, we'll find a library called React Materialize right here, or better yet, Material UI. That's really the best one. So we can check out Material UI, and this is a similar library that implements Google Material Design with a set of React components. So a very common question I get is, why are we not using this library for handling styling? And I'll be honest with you, there's a very simple, straightforward reason. Material UI makes use of what is called JavaScript-based styling. So if you use one of these components in here, like say this app bar thing, okay, you get this app bar, but the problem is that to customize the look of this component right here, you have a somewhat challenging time to change any of the included styling inside of here. And the reason for that is that it uses JavaScript-based styling. In other words, it implements all of its styling inside of the JavaScript world rather than with traditional CSS files. The reason that is harder to customize is that it is naturally more challenging to override styling properties via JavaScript than it is with CSS. CSS is really designed right out of the box to be highly customizable and easily overridable. Whereas with this JavaScript-based styling, life really isn't quite so straightforward. You'll even find a section on here called customization, and they say like, yes, very clearly all the styles are defined in line, and you can read a discussion thread here regarding that decision. It is just not the easiest thing to in the world to work with. And so that is, in particular, why we're not making use of Material UI. So we're going to use Materialize CSS, which is just vanilla, plain old CSS files, easily overridable, easy to set up, and doesn't assume that you're using React right out of the box. Okay, so enough of that big aside, a little bit of a diversion there. Let's focus on getting Materialize CSS started up and installed inside of our project. So on the left-hand nav up here, we'll find a button that says Getting Started. And inside of here, you'll find some different directions for installing Materialize CSS. So there's two primary ways you can easily hook it up to our project in particular. You can either add a link tag to our HTML document that will pull in the link tag or the CSS file dynamically from a CDN. That's completely valid. We could certainly go that way if we want to, but we're going to do things a little bit more interestingly, I would say, and we're going to install all of the CSS into our project by using NPM. So doing the hookup with NPM is admittedly more challenging. It is not as straightforward, but I specifically want to show you how to do this because this is getting more and more popular with CSS libraries that you can install. So we're going to go through this slightly more challenging way using NPM rather than the very easy, straightforward copy and paste link tag, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so we're going to install Materialize CSS as an NPM module to our client-side project. So back inside of our terminal, I'm going to kill the running server. I will change into the client directory. Remember, we've got two sets of package.json files. Right now, we want to add a dependency to the client side of our project. Once inside the client project, we will run npm install --save materialize-css, because that is the name of the library right here. And then we'll let that install run its course. Okay, so while that's installing, we actually do in this case have to wait for the completed install to hook this thing up. So let's pause for a minute, and when we come back, we will make sure that we can include Materialize CSS into our project. So I'll see you in just a second.